Comparing GDP per capita to IQ, on the other hand, you can already see a difference in the scatter plot with the naked eye. Running a simple linear regression on the same raw data as before, we see a positive correlation with an R-squared value of 0.3285 and a p-value of 3.772 times 10 to the minus 10. In other words, when we examine national wealth per capita, just based on its R-squared value, IQ has more than 6 times the explanatory power than ethnic homogeneity does in national economic success, and the p-value is about 1 billion times smaller. Even without any clean-up of statistical outliers, 33% of national wealth variance can reasonably be accounted for just by IQ differences. Just look at how closely the countries are grouped around the line of regression for national average IQ compared to the ethnic fractionalization index. So now we're basically where CS left off in his last video. How can we improve on his analysis? The first thing which immediately stands out to me on this scatter plot is this little group of nations here. GDP per capita much higher than their national average IQs should account for. Hell, the status of Kuwait is damn near miraculous, second only to Singapore in terms of GDP per capita, but below the mean and median in terms of national average IQ, topping out at a meager 86, almost an entire standard deviation below the Western average of 100. If we isolate our data observations by an IQ of less than 90 and a GDP above 35,000 per capita, we end up with a list of only 5 countries: Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. As I mentioned in my last video, this can quite easily be explained away by the fact that the Arabian Peninsula contains massive crude oil reserves. Despite a relatively low national average IQ, their financial success is very simply explained by the fact that the higher IQ industrialized world requires this natural resource that the Arabs geographically lucked into. The reason for these statistical outliers is rather easily explained by oil. So we're going to remove these countries from the data set. In terms of exploring GDP per capita as being a possible function of national average IQ, they are clearly outliers. The second group of outliers which immediately stands out starts with China, a nation with a staggeringly high national average IQ, but well below the international mean in terms of wealth, only just pushing above the first quartile in terms of GDP per capita. Like the countries of the Arabian Peninsula, if we isolate our data observations by an IQ above 90 and a GDP per capita below 15,000, we see another very clear pattern emerge. Armenia, Cambodia, China, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, and Vietnam, all either communist or recently ex-communist countries. A repressive system of totalitarian government that would economically cripple any country regardless of their IQ. We'll remove this group as well. Just by removing these 12 obvious outliers, we're now left with a surprisingly narrow band of countries. Running a linear regression again on this new clean data set, the R-squared value literally doubles from 32.9% to 62.3%, and the p-value drops several orders of magnitude further to 2.2 times 10 to the power of minus 16. But we can improve on this predictive model even further. Looking at the way these nations appear to fall around the line of regression, there appears to be something of an arc. Using a LOS or locally weighted scatterplot smoothing function, we can perform a simple best fit analysis for a nonlinear regression. This works by locally analyzing the data and applying a polynomial line. It's kind of like a quick, dirty method of figuring out what your model should probably look like. As you can see, there is a very clear arc to this data set. GDP clearly increases as a factor of IQ, but it's not a simple linear increase, it's quadratic. Performing a regression using a simple two-factor polynomial model, our R-squared value improves to 69.89%. There are obviously other factors at play, But as of right now, based on this data, we can safely say that more than 2/3 of the variation between nations can reasonably be explained simply by IQ differences. I think it's fair to say that the alt-right mantra is misguided. In other words, you don't need a nation of white people, you need a nation of smart people. Means testing would be a lot more useful in building a strong society than DNA testing. That's not to say that homogeneity isn't a factor at all, but it certainly isn't a big factor when compared to other variables. But, if you don't like hearing these facts because they don't fit your ideology, that's perfectly fine too. Leave, unsubscribe. For anyone else still watching who hasn't already rage quit, the data analysis for this was all performed using the R statistical suite, which is open source. I've provided a link in the low bar as well as a link to download Clive's national data.
Alright, so this video explains why Africa and North America never really developed that well, or South America, compared to the West and Asia, especially Asia in the past, not really communist Asia. And it explains why communist Asia didn't work out so well. So yeah, I mean, this explains things on a national level, and it explains things on an individual level. The number one reason that people do well is they're smart. And the second reason people do well or don't do well is based on a personality trait called industriousness. So like working hard. So if you're smart and you work hard, you do really well. If you're smart and you're lazy, you don't do so good. If you're dumb and you're lazy, you're fucked. That's kind of how the world works.